It began in a rain-soaked corner of Eugene, Oregon, one of those everyday places that people drive past 100 times and never really see. But on this particular morning, something happened that would force the whole town to look and remember. When Rachel Turner, a 42-year-old waitress, paid for an old veteran's hot meal out of her own meager tips, she didn't expect a thank you. She certainly didn't expect to be fired, publicly, cruelly, by a man who cared more about profit than people. But what no one in the Riverside Café expected was what followed. 4 Marines in uniform marching through that little doorway, not to order food, but to demand decency. And suddenly, a small act of kindness became a reckoning the whole town would feel. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Rachel had worked at Riverside Café for 9 years, long enough for the linoleum to know her stride, long enough for the regulars to count on her smile, even when her feet ached and her hands were raw from scrubbing. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. She was the kind of woman who brought extra creamers without being asked, who remembered that Mrs. Gillespie liked her coffee just shy of burnt, and who once stayed late to help a young dishwasher find a ride home in a thunderstorm. She did her job, did it well, and did it quietly. But quiet doesn't mean weak, and kindness doesn't mean blind obedience. It was just before the lunch rush on a Thursday, that kind of morning where everything feels heavier, when the Oregon sky hangs low and the rain hits the pavement like it's mad about something. Rachel had been on her feet since 5:30 a.m. Her sneakers were damp, her apron smelled like bacon grease, and the register tape had already jammed twice before 10. She didn't complain. She never did. Not when Rick Dunham, the manager with too much hair gel and too little patience, barked at her about table 3. Not when he muttered about wasted time every time someone dared to take a breath. Rick ran the cafe like it was boot camp and he was the last man standing. He was the kind of boss who could say, "Good morning," and make it sound like a threat. So when the bell above the door jingled and an old man shuffled in, most folks didn't notice. The clatter of forks, the hiss of the fryer, the drone of lunchtime conversation drowned him out. But Rachel noticed. You could see it in her eyes, the way they softened. He was thin, nearly skeletal, with a windbreaker 2 sizes too big, and boots that had long given up the fight. His gray hair was matted from the rain, and his eyes were the color of wet ash, distant, clouded, like they were still watching something that had happened long ago and wouldn't let go. She met him by the door. "You all right, sir?" she asked gently, her voice cutting through the noise like a lighthouse beam in fog. He blinked, slow and lost. "I was supposed to meet someone here, I think." There was a pause, just a beat. But in that beat, Rachel saw everything. Hunger, exhaustion, and something deeper. Something that looked like he hadn't been truly seen in years, maybe decades. He wore a coat with a faded military patch at the shoulder. Korea, maybe Vietnam. Dog tags peeked from beneath his collar, dulled with age but not with meaning. This wasn't just some wanderer, this was someone who had served, someone who had endured. "You hungry?" she asked. He hesitated. "I could eat. Something warm, maybe." That was it. Rachel didn't ask Rick. She didn't run it past corporate. She didn't post on social media for likes. She just acted. She seated him in a quiet booth near the window, the one with the view of the parking lot and the pharmacy sign that flickered half the time. She fetched a clean blanket from the lost and found box, tucked it gently around his shoulders, and walked straight into the kitchen. She took a $10 bill, money she'd earned in sweat and sore joints, and slid it into the till. Then she called to the cook. "Louise, meatloaf special, mashed potatoes, green beans, extra gravy." Louise raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He knew Rachel, knew her heart. The plate came steaming, the cornbread warm. Rachel placed it before the veteran with the kind of care usually reserved for church altars. He looked at the plate like she'd handed him something holy. "You didn't have to," he said, voice cracking. "I did," she replied, quiet and sure. But not everyone shared her values. Rick saw it. From across the counter, arms folded like some kind of sheriff guarding his own kingdom, he watched the whole thing unfold. He waited until the cafe was packed to step out, like an actor, hitting his mark. "You want to explain what the hell that was?" he demanded, voice slicing through the clink of coffee mugs and polite chatter. Rachel turned slowly. She wasn't surprised. She was ready. "He didn't ask for anything. I paid for the meal myself." Rick scoffed. "Doesn't matter. That's not how we do things here. You want to feed the whole damn street too? You working for the Salvation Army now?" The room went still. A mother stopped wiping her toddler's hands. A man at the corner booth pulled out his earbud. Even the fry cook stopped mid-sizzle. "He's a veteran," Rachel said, steady as a mountain. "He looked hungry. I did what any decent person would do." Rick stepped closer, his voice low and cutting. "You don't make that call. You don't run this place. I do." Then, with a smirk and a flourish that made everyone turn their heads, he announced to the entire room, "Ladies and gentlemen, this employee just gave away a free meal on our dime. So from now on, if anyone needs a handout, just ask Rachel. She'll foot the bill." The veteran looked up, confused. Rachel's cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from fury. And then, in the quiet that followed, the old man stood. His hands trembled. His voice did not. "She didn't do anything wrong," he said. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table, an old, worn purple heart gleaming dully under the cafe's yellow lights. "I served in caisson," he added. "Most of my unit didn't come home, but I did, and I know what decency looks like." No one spoke, not yet, but the tide had started to turn. Something bigger than rules and receipts was beginning to stir. Rachel had been fired for kindness, but kindness doesn't die quietly. Not in Eugene. Not that day. Not with 4 Marines already on their way. The rain hadn't let up. It slid down the cafe's windows in gray streaks, pooling at the base of the door like it had nowhere better to be. Inside, Riverside Café was full to the seams, steam rising off the grill, customers hunched over biscuits and coffee, jackets dripping on cracked vinyl seats. A local mechanic laughed loudly at the bar. 2 toddlers wailed in stereo from the corner booth. You couldn't hear your own thoughts, and that was just how Rick Dunham liked it. Noise meant distraction. Distraction kept people from noticing the cracks. But Rachel Turner noticed everything. He looked like a man time had forgotten. His coat was army green, patched and fraying at the cuffs. His pants were baggy, the hem darkened by soaked boots that had long since lost their shape. His white hair curled at the edges with rainwater, and his eyes, pale and milky, darted across the room like he didn't quite trust it. He could have been 75 or 90. With war, age doesn't always show up on time. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Just hovered near the door like he was still waiting for someone to invite him in. Rachel set her rag aside and stepped forward. "Sir," she asked softly, walking toward him like he might break if approached too fast, "are you all right?" His eyes settled on her face, but his words took time to find. "I think I was supposed to meet someone. Here. Do you remember their name?" "No," he said almost apologetically, "but this looks like the place." That's when she saw it. A thin chain around his neck, barely visible under his collar. Dog tags. faded with age, one corner bent, and on the sleeve of his coat a tattered patch, the 1st Marine Division. Rachel's heart sank with recognition. He wasn't just another drifter. He was someone who had once worn a uniform, someone who had likely bled in a jungle, or crawled across frozen dirt, or stood alone in a foxhole while the rest of the world went on sipping coffee in warm buildings like this. "You hungry?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "I could eat," he replied after a pause. "Something warm would be nice." She nodded. No more questions, no red tape. The rules posted in the staff room flashed in her mind, Rick's laminated commandment, hung like gospel over the sink. We're a business, not a shelter. But that wasn't going to matter today. Not to her. She guided him to booth 7, the one near the corner window with the lopsided blinds. The seats had tears taped over with duct tape, but it was dry, and the radiator beneath it hummed with heat. She helped him out of his coat, damp and heavy, and noticed one of his bootlaces was missing entirely. Then she fetched a plaid blanket from the lost and found bin behind the front desk, still folded the way someone's grandmother might have left it, and draped it gently across his knees. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't care. A couple at table 3 were arguing over hash browns. Lily was juggling 2 refill pitchers and looked like she might faint. Rick hadn't even glanced up from the back register, too busy scowling over a shipment invoice that didn't balance. Rachel headed to the kitchen. She opened the small tip envelope she kept tucked in her apron and pulled out a $10 bill, 3 hours' worth of patience and hustle. She slid the bill into the register drawer without a word and looked over to Louise, the head cook. "Meatloaf special," she said. "Mashed potatoes, green." She brought out the plate herself, steaming and generous. The man looked at it like it was the first real food he'd seen in weeks. His eyes welled just slightly, though he blinked it away. She set down a glass of warm water beside the plate, refilled it before he could ask. "Country?" he murmured. "No," Rachel replied, adjusting the blanket on his lap. "Just doing what's right. But even kindness has a price." From behind the counter, Rick emerged, arms swinging like a man preparing for a showdown. He hadn't missed a thing. His expression was tight, jaw clenched, footsteps sharp against the tile. Rachel could feel the temperature drop before he even spoke. "You mind telling me what the hell that was?" he said, loud enough for half the cafe to hear. Rachel turned to face him, standing between Rick and the booth like a shield. "He didn't ask for anything," she said. "And I didn't charge the cafe. I paid for it myself." "That's not the point," Rick snapped. "You think you get to make those calls now? You want to feed the whole street while you're at it? This ain't a soup line, Rachel. This is a business." "He's a veteran," she replied, fire creeping into her tone. "He looked hungry, so I gave him a meal. That's all." Rick stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You don't get to decide who eats for free. I do. And you just cost us, what, $10? Rachel's reply was swift. "I covered it." "That's not the damn point," he growled. "The point is you broke protocol. You made me look like I can't control my own staff." And there it was, the truth behind the tantrum. It wasn't about money. It never was. It was about power, and Rachel had challenged it, not with shouting, but with a simple plate of hot food. Rick turned, eyes sweeping the cafe, and raised his voice for all to hear. "Everyone," he called. A bitter grin stretched across his face. "Just so we're clear, if you're down on your luck, don't worry. Rachel here's buying. Free meals for everyone. Isn't that sweet?" The laughter didn't come. Someone at table 5 lowered their coffee. A man at the counter adjusted his hat, suddenly quiet. At booth 7, the veteran looked down, confused. He didn't seem to understand what was happening. Or maybe he did, and it just hurt too much to show it. Rachel stood still, jaw tight, refusing to shrink under the weight of embarrassment. And then the veteran moved. He stood slowly, his hands unsteady, his knees creaking beneath the blanket. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out something small and silver. A military badge, dulled at the edges, a purple heart. "I served in Quezon." "They'll come," he whispered, voice distant. "They always come." Rachel didn't understand what he meant, not yet, but she didn't need to. She reached for her apron strings and untied them slowly, not in shame but in quiet defiance. She folded it neatly and laid it beside the plate she had paid for. "I did what was right," she said, loud enough for anyone with ears to hear. Rick didn't reply. Outside, the rain kept falling. But the moment had shifted, and somewhere, maybe already halfway down the block, boots were marching toward that cafe. Not for revenge, for something harder, justice. The cafe didn't fall silent all at once. Silence never enters a room boldly. It sneaks in sideways, bit by bit, starting with a half-raised fork, a stopped spoon, the soft clink of a coffee mug being set down just a little too gently. That's how it happened at Riverside Café, the moment Rick Dunham turned on Rachel Turner with that rehearsed sneer and hollow voice. She had just placed her apron, folded neatly like it still mattered, on the counter near the register. The old veteran was still standing by his booth, uncertain, his hands hanging by his sides like weights. The purple heart he had set down earlier gleamed faintly beneath the flickering ceiling light, its bent edges catching just enough shine to remind anyone paying attention that this wasn't about food anymore. Rick took one step forward. The heel of his polished boot hit the linoleum with a smack too sharp for the quiet room. "You think you get to play hero now, Rachel?" he asked, his voice riding that high wire line between mockery and venom. "You think this is about you being kind?" Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't move. Rick turned then, pivoting like an actor in a play, making sure the room saw him. "Just so we're clear, folks," he said, louder now, "this employee here just handed out a free meal, on our dime, from our kitchen, to anyone who looks like they could use a little sympathy. That's the new policy, apparently." A nervous laugh rippled from the front table, half-hearted, quickly smothered. The cafe wasn't buying it. The customers had seen too much already, the blanket Rachel had offered, the way the old man had thanked her with a voice that trembled, the way she had paid, literally, with money from her own pocket, to do something decent. "She didn't steal anything," said a voice from the kitchen window. Louise, the cook, leaned out just far enough for his face to be seen, his eyes narrowed. "She paid for it." Rick ignored him. His eyes stayed on Rachel. "You don't get to make the rules, Rachel, I do. You think you're better than the system? That this place runs on feelings?" He laughed bitterly. "We're not some small-town fairy tale." Rick's eyes flashed. "And I'm the Pope. Everyone's got a story. Doesn't mean we go handing out charity like candy." That's when the veteran, still standing by his booth, one hand trembling slightly, spoke again. His voice, hoarse and fragile, carried in a way that pierced the tension like a thread through fabric. "She did what you wouldn't," he said, not accusing, just stating. "That's the difference." Rick dismissed him with a wave of his hand like shooing off a child. "Sir, please eat your food and stay out of staff business." But the man didn't sit, didn't eat. Instead, he looked around the cafe as though searching for something, someone, and whispered again, almost to himself. "They'll come." Rick scoffed. "What does that mean? You summoning ghosts now?" Rachel took a step forward, placing herself gently between Rick and the man. "He's not the one out of line here," she said, her voice gaining weight. "You fired me in front of strangers for feeding a man who served this country." "You're damn right I did," Rick snapped, jabbing a finger toward her apron. "Turned in your colors, remember? That means you're no longer staff. You're just someone who doesn't follow orders." "Then take it out of my tips," Rachel replied. "Dock me, write me up. But you didn't have to humiliate me." The front door opened and the bell gave a timid jingle, but it was just a delivery guy with a crate of paper towels. Still, every head turned. The atmosphere inside had shifted, tilted like the moment before a storm breaks. Something bigger was brewing. "You made a choice," Rick said coldly, his voice dropping lower now, quieter. "And choices have consequences." At the bar, Reggie, the regular in the John Deere cap who sat there every morning with black coffee and a crossword, cleared his throat. "She's been here longer than you have," he said quietly. "She remembers names. Remembers how I take my coffee. Can't say the same about you." "Excuse me?" Rick asked, turning with arms out like a stage performer caught in bad lighting. "Now everyone's a critic?" Lily, standing by the drink station, wiped at her eyes. She looked 19, maybe 20, barely holding together the nerve it took to stand still under pressure. "She walks me to my car after close," she said suddenly, "even when it's not her shift." "You're not helping," Rick growled, voice sharp. "She's the reason I didn't quit my first week," Lily added, louder now. More voices joined in. "She bought me lunch when I forgot my wallet," one customer said from the corner booth. "She helped my wife into her car after her knee surgery," said another. Rick's confidence faltered, his stance shifted. His mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, he looked like a man surrounded. "This is mutiny," he said, finally, shaking his head. "No," said Louise, stepping out fully from the kitchen. He was still holding his chef's towel in one hand, now slung over his shoulder like a white flag. "This is what happens when people stop being afraid of you." That's when it happened. The door opened again, not with the clatter of takeout or the breeze of someone ducking in for a quick refill. This time, 4 silhouettes appeared. Broad, square-shouldered, boots damp from the sidewalk, expressions unreadable. They wore uniforms. The room stopped breathing. Even the sizzling from the fryer seemed to pause, like it understood the weight in the room had shifted. The first Marine, stocky, mid-40s, bars on his shoulder, scanned the cafe like a man looking for a target, not a table. He nodded toward the booth. "Sir," he said to the veteran, "we got your message." The old man stood, slower this time, his hand brushing the table where the Purple Heart still lay. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said, voice quieter now. "We know," the Marine replied. "We came to make sure it doesn't go unanswered." Rick stepped forward with a tight, nervous smile. "Gentlemen," he said, "if there's a misunderstanding—" The Marine cut him off with a glance. "Are you the manager?" "I am." "Then you're the one who fired a woman for showing compassion." "This is a business," Rick said, his voice growing more defensive. "We have rules. She broke them." "She honored something higher than policy," the Marine replied. Rachel said nothing. She didn't need to. The entire room, customers, staff, strangers, stood on her side now. And it wasn't because she made a scene. It was because she hadn't. Rick's voice cracked. "You all want to turn this into a circus? Fine. But don't expect an apology." "No one's asking for a show," said the Marine. "We're asking for accountability." Rick turned to the room like he was looking for an ally, but found only folded arms, steady gazes, and the heavy silence of a crowd that had seen too much. Rachel remained still, her hands no longer trembling, her voice clear when she finally spoke. "I didn't do it for attention. I did it because it was right." That was when the applause began. It wasn't loud, it wasn't choreographed, but it was real. The kind of applause that comes from people who've seen the truth and can no longer pretend they didn't. It wasn't just the front door that opened. It was the room, the air. The entire rhythm of the place cracked wide open the second that bell jingled and 4 figures crossed the threshold, wet boots tracking in rain, shoulders squared like stone, their presence so pronounced it made people sit up straighter without realizing they'd done it. These weren't customers. These weren't tourists, salesmen, or delivery drivers. They were Marines. At the head of the group walked a man with sergeant stripes stitched onto his sleeve and a gaze that made Rick Dunham freeze mid-step behind the counter. His name tag read Cole, and he looked like a man who'd spent his life walking into rooms and calming them, or taking control when they wouldn't. Behind him, 3 more. One taller, built like a firehouse beam with sharp eyes and a scar that ran under his chin like a question left unanswered. One with broader shoulders and a calm, almost sorrowful demeanor. And the last, lean but wiry, scanning the cafe like someone who knew how to find exits without thinking about it. The room went dead quiet. Even the friar in the back seemed to hush. Rachel Turner, standing beside the register, still in her street clothes, didn't know their names, but when she saw the old veteran at booth 7 rise to his feet, slowly, shakily, like a man who'd waited his whole life for backup, she knew exactly who they were. The sergeant stepped toward the booth first, nodding once. "Sir," he said, "we got your message." The veteran looked like he'd aged 10 years since arriving at the cafe, but now, standing in front of these men, his eyes sharpened. He pointed to Rachel, not with pride, but with quiet urgency. "She fed me," he said, "and she got fired for it." The sergeant turned. His eyes landed on Rick like a targeting scope. "Is that true?" he asked. Rick tried to smile. "There's been some confusion," he began, but his voice lacked the usual venom. "This isn't a military installation. It's a business. There are rules." Rick tried to smile. "There's been some confusion," he began, but his voice lacked the usual venom. "This isn't a military installation. It's a business. There are rules." The Marine with the scar stepped forward. His voice was low, but it carried. "So you fired someone for feeding a man who's seen more combat than you've seen daylight?" "That's not what happened," Rick insisted, but he'd already lost control of the narrative. The younger Marine, shorter, broader, with eyes like stone, spoke next. "We know this man. His name is Walter Hagerty. He served with our unit's founder, our commander's grandfather, back in Vietnam. What you think of him is irrelevant. What he's done? That matters." Walter, the old man, didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Rachel stood still, letting it all sink in. The same woman who had been shouted down in front of strangers was now being defended by men who'd carried their brothers through mud and shrapnel. The sergeant looked around the cafe, his voice calm but undeniable. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said, "but we are here to set the record straight." Rick folded his arms tightly. "You all want to play savior, fine, but I don't need a lecture from people who don't pay the rent on this place. I didn't ask her to give that man a free meal. She broke protocol. She disrespected the chain of command." The Marine with the scar leaned in, not threatening, just resolute. "We don't forget the people who stand up for one another. You might run this business, but you don't run respect." "Who the hell are you to come in here and judge how I manage my cafe?" Rick fired back. "We're not here to judge," the sergeant said evenly. "We're here to speak up. There's a difference." Behind them, Lily stood motionless near the drink station, her eyes wide. Louise, half out of the kitchen, leaned on the counter like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Even the dishwasher, a 17-year-old kid named Omar, stepped out from the back, wiping his hands on his apron. And the cafe, that small, forgotten corner of Eugene, Oregon, began to shift. Because it wasn't just about Rachel anymore. It was about what kind of place they all wanted this to be. "We train for a lot of things," said the tall Marine with the scar. "But no one trains for how to lose their dignity quietly. She didn't lose hers. You tried to take it." Rick scoffed. "She gave away food. It costs money. This isn't charity." "That plate probably cost $10, said one of the Marines. "But you're about to learn what it costs when people stop trusting your name." Near the window, Cheryl Miles, the woman who ran the salon 2 doors down, stood up. "I've seen how you treat people, Rick," she said. "I've seen the notes you leave, the way you cut people's hours when they speak up." She wasn't fired for giving. It was Reggie, still sitting in his booth. "You never said good morning to me, Rick. Not once in 2 years. Rachel did every day. You don't build a business on policy. You build it on people. You just fired your foundation." Silence followed. The Marine said nothing more. They didn't need to. Omar cleared his throat. "She's the only one who ever asks if I need a ride home. I take 2 buses and walk the last stretch. Rachel knew that." Then Lily, cheeks red, said softly, "She paid half for my car brakes. I didn't even ask." Rick looked cornered, but it was his pride that refused to retreat. "So what now?" he snapped. "You gonna shut me down with a Facebook post? You gonna cancel me?" "No," said Sergeant Cole. "We don't cancel. We remember. And we support our own." He turned to Rachel. "Miss Turner," he said respectfully, "we're sorry this happened to you, but I promise you it won't be forgotten." Rachel nodded once, unable to speak. Her throat tightened, but not from fear this time. It was something deeper, something close to grace. Then, from the back of the room, someone began clapping, not loud, not theatrical, just real. Then another joined, then another. Rick stood frozen, watching a room he once controlled turn quietly, firmly away from him. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The sun peeked through the gray like a forgotten promise. And the Marines? They stood at the booth for one more moment. One of them reached down, picked up the Purple Heart, and placed it back in Walter's hand. "Thank you for reminding us," he said. Walter didn't reply. He didn't have to. They walked out, silent and unified. And behind them, something stayed behind. A weight, a memory, a shift in the air. The kind of shift that only happens when good men refuse to let wrongness stand unchallenged. Rachel stood at the window, watching them fade into the sidewalk. She wasn't just seen, she was believed. It started with a cell phone, specifically the one sitting quietly on the edge of Cheryl Miles' coffee cup, screen propped up just so, camera rolling long before anyone realized the Marines were coming. No dramatic pans, no filters, just raw truth captured in a moment that no one expected would matter outside that cafe. But it did. It mattered more than anyone in Eugene could have guessed. By the time Rachel Turner stepped out into the Oregon mist that afternoon, her coat buttoned up against the chill, apron still folded in her hand, the video had already begun to circulate. Cheryl had posted it to a local Facebook group for small businesses, just as a gesture, a quiet "this isn't right" to her neighbors. Then it spread. It hit a local veterans forum before dinner. By nightfall, it was on Twitter. By morning, Purple Heart, public outrage, and one woman's quiet stand. She hadn't asked for any of this. That was the part people kept missing. She hadn't posted the video. She hadn't gone on a rant or demanded justice. She'd fed a hungry man and got punished for it. That was all. But somehow that simple act of humanity had ripped the top off something deeper, something raw and waiting. And now it was spilling out all over the country. The first phone call came from a news outlet out of Portland, then another from a podcast in Seattle. Then a producer from a national morning show asked if she'd be open to telling her story on air. Rachel didn't return most of the messages. Her voicemail filled up within hours. But there was one email she opened twice before responding. Subject: Job opportunity. Stand with us. From Jordan Malik, Hagerty Veterans Outreach Center. She clicked it late that evening. sitting at her kitchen table with the same mug of tea she'd reheated twice. "Miss Turner, my name is Jordan Malik, and I oversee operations at the Hagerty Veterans Outreach Center here in Eugene. Walter is a friend of our founder. He told us what you did. Then we saw it for ourselves. We're hiring, not just anyone. We want someone with judgment, grace, and compassion. If you're open to it, we'd be honored to offer you a position. Full-time, good hours, benefits, real work that makes a difference. You've already shown us who you are. Let us show you what we stand for." Rachel read it 3 times. She didn't cry, not then. But she did let the tears come later, once she'd picked up the phone, once she'd heard Jordan's calm voice explain the job, the center, the mission. It wasn't glamorous. She'd help with intake, answer phones, direct veterans to services, organize meals and housing referrals. She'd sit with people and make them feel like they mattered again. And somehow that was exactly what she needed. She said yes. The very next morning, she rode the same bus that once dropped her off for cafe shifts, but this time, she kept her head high. The Hagerty Center wasn't fancy, just a converted building with wide halls and soft paint, but it felt different, alive, real. Walter was there, sitting in the front lobby with a paper cup of coffee and a crossword puzzle he wasn't really solving. "You made it," he said with a soft smile. "Yeah," Rachel whispered. "I made it." On the wall near the entrance, someone had already taped up a printed still image from the video. Rachel standing with the Marines behind her, arms crossed. Beneath it, a quote handwritten in marker. "You don't punish people for being decent." Back at Riverside Café, the world looked different. The following Monday, the breakfast rush never came. No familiar faces, no clatter of regulars shuffling in. Even the mechanic who always grumbled about the hash browns, Rick Dunham, stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up as usual. But his posture had changed. He moved slower now, voice quieter, his usual swagger replaced by a kind of invisible weight. Because the comments didn't stop at Rachel's phone. They poured into the cafe's Facebook page, Yelp, Google reviews. "She gave a man a warm meal, you gave her unemployment." "Not eaten anywhere that fires kindness." "You lost the soul of your cafe. You don't deserve to run it." Someone started a petition, new management at Riverside Café. Within 3 days, it had 15,000 signatures. Rick tried to post a statement. "We regret any misunderstandings. We remain committed to treating customers and staff with dignity." But no one was buying it. Because the truth was too clear and the video too damning. By Wednesday, Cheryl stopped by the cafe, not to eat, but to deliver a quiet message. "You think this will blow over?" she asked him, arms folded. "Think again." That afternoon, Eileen March walked into the Hagerty Center. A woman in her early 60s, she wore a blazer that didn't quite match her purse and a look of someone unused to apologizing. She introduced herself softly. "I'm Rick's business partner, silent partner to be exact." Rachel didn't blink. "I know who you are." "I didn't know," Eileen said. "I should have. I funded half that place and never once asked how he ran it." "You don't owe me anything," Rachel said, even though she meant it and didn't. "I do," Eileen replied, and pulled an envelope from her handbag. "It's from my own account, no strings, and the cafe's up for sale. I won't stand behind that man anymore." Rachel took the envelope. Later, she opened it alone. Inside, a handwritten note and a cashier's check for $5,000. "Thank you for showing the rest of us what integrity looks like. Eileen." But money wasn't the real reward. The real gift was something quieter, something longer lasting. Because from that point forward, Rachel's story didn't belong to just Eugene. It belonged to anyone who had ever stood alone for what was right, to anyone who had handed someone a plate or offered a ride or said, "I see you," without needing recognition. Veterans groups reposted the video across social media. A woman in Kentucky mailed a handwritten letter to the Hagerty Center addressed only to the waitress who did the right thing. A teenager in Arizona made it his graduation speech, and someone carved the quote, "You don't punish people for being decent," into a small wooden bench and placed it outside a shelter in Boise. Rachel didn't ask for the spotlight, but sometimes the spotlight finds people who never wanted it, because they're the ones who shine without trying. And the rest of the world? Well, the world remembered, not because she shouted. It was near closing time at the Hagerty Veterans Outreach Center. The hum of voices had softened to quiet typing, the click of a printer, the faint clink of coffee mugs being rinsed in the break room sink. Outside the windows, the Oregon dusk stretched across the parking lot in long orange bands, fading into the tree line like the end of a long breath. Rachel Turner sat at her desk near the front, flipping through intake forms, a pen resting behind one ear. She wasn't wearing an apron anymore, no name tag, no manager standing behind her with folded arms and clipped sighs. Here, no one barked. Here, no one demanded that decency wait for permission. Walter Hagerty was still there, same chair by the front window, a blanket tucked over his knees and a crossword puzzle on his lap that had barely been touched. His coffee had gone cold. His eyes, however, were clear, clearer than they'd been in days. "You need anything before I lock up?" Rachel asked, walking over. Walter didn't look at her at first. He kept his gaze on the window, on the world outside, but he shook his head. "Just thinking," he said. "About what?" "Back then, when I was in country," he murmured. "Didn't matter where you came from, color, faith, politics, didn't matter. All that mattered was whether the guy next to you had your back." He looked at her then, eyes steady. "You had mine. You didn't even know me, but you had mine." Rachel leaned gently against the wall beside him. "I used to wonder if I mattered," she admitted. "I worked hard, showed up early, stayed late, did the job. But it always felt like I was one mistake away from being disposable. Like if I dropped a plate or said the wrong thing, it'd all disappear." Walter nodded slowly. "That's because a lot of people confuse power with purpose. That manager of yours, he thought respect was something you could demand. But real respect?" He tapped his chest lightly. "It comes from what people say about you when you're not in the room." Rachel smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just the kind that rests on your lips when something clicks inside, quietly, finally. "You sure you're not supposed to be writing a book?" she teased. Walter chuckled. "Nah, I just lived long enough to know what decency looks like." There was a pause then, not awkward, just full, like the air itself had settled down to listen. "Did you really call the Marines after I left?" she asked. Walter shook his head slowly. "Didn't have to," he said. "One of them checks in on me every Sunday. I told him what happened, told him a good woman got fired for doing something decent." "And that was enough?" "You don't get it," he said, turning toward her more fully now. "When you're good to one of us, you're good to all of us." Later that night, Rachel finally opened. "Thank you for showing the rest of us what integrity looks like. I hope this helps you build something better. Eileen." Rachel didn't cry. Not because she wasn't moved, but because the tears had already been spent. What she felt now wasn't sadness, it was validation. Someone had seen her, and for once they didn't look away. She picked up her phone and opened the video one more time, not to watch herself, but to read the comments. "She's the reason I believe in people again. There's hope, and her name is Rachel Turner. What if we were all just a little more like her?" That one stopped her, because that's what it had always been about. Not fame, not revenge, just not turning away. In the end, what Rachel learned and what the town learned with her is something older than policy, older than protocol. Kindness is not weakness. And sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is care, especially when no one else does. She didn't stand on a table and shout. She didn't hold a sign. She didn't start a movement. She handed a man a hot plate of food and said, "You matter." And that simple choice, made without fanfare, without permission, shook a building, woke up a town, and reminded a country that decency still counts for something. Riverside Café never quite recovered. New ownership came eventually, but the soul of the place, the one that wore sneakers and carried cornbread and remembered every name and coffee order, was gone. People remembered that. But at the Hagerty Center, something better was growing, quietly, daily. And Rachel? She was finally where she belonged, not just seen, but respected, not just heard, but believed, not just employed, but valued. Because in the end it turned out that one simple act of goodness wasn't small at all. It was enough. It was everything. If Rachel's story moved you even just a little, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. What would you have done in her shoes? Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right when it wasn't easy? We'd love to hear your story. Every share, every comment helps us shine a light on everyday courage and kindness. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next real-life story that reminds us all. Decency still matters, and it starts with one person. Let's keep the conversation going below.